So Jacob, you've talked about using your background in narrative film to find a real human way into an idealistic film that's based around kind of a heady idea. So tell me about how you used your background to work with Robert and where the film all began.
Well, I think of film as a transformation machine. I like to go sit in a dark theater, go into that machine, and then come out changed at the end of a movie. So I actually don't like to think about it like a documentary or a fiction film. I like to think about them as movies. And every time I go to see a movie, I want it to be a good story. I want it to be funny. I want it to make me laugh and cry, and I want to get something out of that experience. And I treated this like any other film, any other film you might approach. So I guess that was my approach. And Bob was in on that. I mean, we share a sensibility. We share a sense of humor. When we met, that was one of the first things that I realized about him, is that even though we're making a film about the economy, that it could be in some ways funny and it could be in some ways moving. And he was excited about that as well. He didn't want to make a documentary like any other documentary. He wanted to tell a movie as well.
Well, the subject matter is so heavy. If there wasn't some room for laughter, we'd all just go, there's no hope.
Yeah, I mean, I've said often that humor is the universal disinfectant. It's the way I can actually talk to people who don't share my political persuasion, and sometimes even win them over, because it opens people's minds. They can actually begin to understand things that they otherwise would be very resistant to.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you're making a film about the American financial crisis, which is always going to be controversial. I'm curious if there are any materials or people you wanted to interview that you couldn't, that declined? Any material you couldn't get into the film?
Well, let me just say that the film is really less about the financial crisis than it is about a 30-year trend toward widening inequality. The financial crisis was really almost an inevitable part of it, but we still are surging to inequality, greater and greater inequality, and there will be more financial crises down the line if we don't reverse the trends.
Yeah, and just to build on what he said, often when you hear a film about widening income inequality, you think about it in partisan terms. Are you a conservative or are you a liberal? Depends on how you approach the topic. And it was important when we were making this film to not be stuck in those constructs, to try and step back and take a bigger view of the issue and sort of maybe get out of, I felt as a consumer before I started making this film, trapped in the 24-hour news cycle. I felt that was the only way people could talk about this stuff, and frankly I wasn't getting anything out of it. And I thought by making this film I wanted to challenge my assumptions and challenge the assumptions of people on both sides of the political spectrum to see if they might take another look at this topic and maybe understand it in a way that they hadn't before.
Mm-hmm. And in the film you discuss, for everyone who hasn't seen it, that the gap between the wages for workers and our productivity is due to globalization and technology. So for everyone who hasn't seen the film, how can we work to solve that problem and still have our country be developing technologically?
Well, you know, it is true that globalization and technology have driven a lot of the changes over the last 40 years. But that doesn't mean we couldn't have done something about it. It doesn't mean that this was inevitable. One of the things that we hear from the other side is that this is just the way that the globalization of the world has been going, and there's nothing we could have done about the economy. That's simply not true. I mean, Germany, as one country that Bob sometimes cites, their top 1% take some about 11% of the income in their economy, relative to America, where it was over 23.5% when the economy crashed. So depending on how you control, what the rules you set for your free market in your country, in America, change the way these outcomes happen. And it doesn't mean that globalization and technology are the only factors that can affect this. You might be able to say this.
Well, I think you said it well. There are many things that we can do, we still can do, to mitigate the negative effects of globalization and technological change. There are many positive effects of globalization and technological change, but they clearly are driving a wedge in the American workforce, and if we just simply stand back and say there's nothing that can be done, we're going to see more and more income and more wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people, and a greater and greater number of people less and less economically secure and more desperate.
Mm-hmm. Well, I definitely felt like my eyes were opened when I saw the movie. So, after screening the film, have people come up to you and said, wow, you know, like what has the response been? Either people disagreeing with what you guys explore or saying, wow, this has opened my eyes to something I never knew existed?
Well, he's talked about it a fair amount. I can tell you the first screening at Sundance, we got a big standing ovation, and which every time I've been at a screening with him, you know, it's amazing to see him after you see the movie. But somebody stood up and they said, I can't believe I have to admit this, but I cried at a movie that I thought was just going to be about the economy. And then she turned around and said sheepishly, did anybody else feel that way? And other people in the audience sort of raised their hands and ducked their head. And the truth is, it's an emotional film. It works as a movie, and we haven't really gotten the partisan reaction that you'd think from people. They're just not receiving the film that way if you go to see it. Before you go to see the film, you might think that, but afterwards, I think we're having different
I
discussions.
totally agree. Thank you so much, guys. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.